So last week was Easter, right? And Jerry gently encouraged us to roll away that stone of uncertainty and to return to our true self that awaits within. So thank you, Jerry. The idea of reconnecting to my resurrected self invited me to ask, well, what happens once I make that connection? So what now? And that reminded me of the Zen story of a student asking his master that, so what happens after enlightenment, since I'm doing all this work to get there? And the Zen master looks at his student and says, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So, for me, that just simply means that as long as I have skin on in this world, there will be bills to pay and food to cook and things to do on the physical plane of this life. So living our spiritual truth in the world is not necessarily about what we do, but rather why or how we do what we do. It's all about showing up in our lives. And showing up is one of the core disciplines of integral ministry. Waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up. So how I show up in my life was very vividly brought home to me very early in my ministerial training. Now, this happens many years ago, but it is still a meaningful experience for me today. So one of the challenges of ministerial training is that the student has to be known by the UWMs whether or not they're capable of being a minister. And so there's this process called licensing and ordination in which 4 times within the student's career of education, they have to appear before a group of unity ministers. They have to give a talk, and then they have to answer questions that are designed to help the ministers that are evaluating them understand whether they have the skills and the mental or emotional attitude to be a good minister. So you can imagine that as a student, this is not necessarily a happy or comfortable place to be. And in fact, to even compound it, each time that you go before your L&O team, you not only have one group of ministers that you have to do this for, you have 2. And each group independently evaluates you and then gives you feedback, sometimes uncomfortable feedback. Well, so there is a level of anxiety that a student feels when they go through this process. So my very first L&O experience, I was all focused on giving the right answer. In fact, as I met with that first team, I can remember saying an answer to a question, and then these words came out of my mouth. That's what you were looking for? Well, I have to tell you that my first L&O experience with that first team was not a happy or a comfortable experience. I did not feel connected. I left feeling judged. And I knew that the next morning I had to go and do it all over again. So I go home. And Lawrence is about 40 minutes away from the village. And I go home and we have our evening meal with my family. Now, one of my practices in my married life was to wash the dishes. Because for many years in my early married life, I was a printer. And printers get all kinds of ink under their nails and in their skin, and washing dishes is a great way to get your hands clean. So I was washing the evening dishes, and I went to let the water out of the sink, and it just stood there. It did not drain. So I went and I got the plunger, and I'm there on that sink going, and the water drained. I had removed the clog. I was feeling really good about it. And then I went downstairs to our finished basement, and there was water dripping from the sheetrock ceiling. So somewhere in the plastic pipe run, that vigorous plunging in the sink had separated the pipe. Now, it's a solid ceiling. I had no idea where. So you have to understand, plumbing is one of the least favorite activities of being a homeowner that I do. So here I am, standing on a step stool, hammer in my hand, knocking holes in the sheetrock ceiling, water, dust from the plaster falling on my head, trying to find where in the train across the room the pipe separated. Then all of a sudden, it all came together. My plumbing experience, my disconnect with the L&O team earlier that day, it all hit me at once. It was not what I did. It was not about being right. It was about how I was showing up. So with that aha, I found where the pipe separated. I got my glue out and I glued the pipe back together. And I knew that I would be patching holes in the ceiling at some point. And the next day I went and I met with my second L&O team. And I went with the attitude that I was there to show up and love them. Nothing else. And I had a wonderful experience. And that continued to be my experience throughout the rest of my education process with my L&O team. So, chop wood, carry water. It is not about what we do in our lives. It is about how we show up to do it. It becomes our intention to interact with the world, with one another, in the most authentic way possible. Before rolling away the stone of uncertainty and awakening to our spiritual self, the typical way of our showing up is to show up from our personality, from our personal self, that personal identity and ego that we have spent a lifetime crafting. But enlightenment, or resurrection, if you will, changes our perception of self and our perception about the world around us, and it changes how we show up. So the stories I have heard about the enlightenment process seem to have a common fulcrum: oneness. In the moment of awakening, the personal experience becomes an expanded experience of universal connection. I remember reading about the enlightenment experience of the American Zen teacher Adyashanti, and it was in his book, Emptiness Dancing. And Adyashanti had just completed his morning meditation. It had been his practice to do this for many years. And as he completed the meditation and was ready to open his eyes, he heard a bird chirp outside the open window. And he writes, and I want to read what he wrote. He said, I experienced a spontaneous seeing that everything was one. For me, that manifested as hearing a bird call, a chirp, in the front yard. And from somewhere inside me, the question arose, what is it that hears this sound? Now, I had never asked this question before. I suddenly realized that I was as much the sound and the bird as the one hearing the bird. And that hearing and sound and bird were all manifestations of one thing. And I cannot say what that one thing is except to say one thing. I opened my eyes and I found the same thing was happening in the room. The wall and the one seeing the wall were the same thing. I thought that very strange, and I realized that the one thinking this was another manifestation of that. And I got up and began to move around the house looking for something that wasn't part of the one. But everything was a reflection of that one thing. Everything was divine. And I end the story that he wrote. He goes on to say that the oneness was so pervasive for him that he even went into the bathroom and looked at the toilet. And the toilet was also part of the oneness. The toilet was divine. So the moment of enlightenment is, I believe, a felt experience of unity's first two principles. One, that there is only God, and two, that what I am, my true nature, is part of that divinity that I call God. The experience of universal oneness creates a profound change in the way that we show up. Before the shift in perception, we live a separated existence. We focus on what I believe is best for me. After we experience that oneness, we are compelled to live from that state of being one. We are no longer separated. We live as part of the one beingness that we call God. We show up from what unity calls the Christ nature of our higher self. And when we know that we are part of universal oneness, we act differently because we have a new relationship with what is. So how do I show up in that authentic way that is a true expression of my higher self? Well, showing up starts, I believe, with holding a heart intention. We set an intention to see and to respond to others and to our life conditions that are around us from the love that we are. Over my years being a minister, I have collected many stories to use in Sunday messages. And I don't remember exactly where I acquired this following story. It may have been a chicken soup story. I just simply don't remember. But it speaks to me about showing up. And showing up is the energy of love. It was entitled Breakfast at McDonald's. And I want to share this story with you. The writer says, I am a mother of 3, ages 14, 12, and 3, and have recently completed my college degree. The last class I had to take was sociology. And my last project of the term was called Smile. The class was asked to go out and smile at 3 people and document their reactions. Now, I'm a very friendly person, and I always smile at everyone and say hello, so I thought this would be a piece of cake, literally. Soon after we were assigned the project, my husband and my youngest son and I went out to McDonald's one crisp, cold March morning. We were standing in line, waiting to be served, when all of a sudden, everyone around us began backing away. And then even my husband did. I did not move an inch, but an overwhelming sense of panic welled up inside of me as I turned to see why they had moved. And as I turned around, I smelled a horrible, dirty body smell. And there standing behind me were 2 poor, homeless men. As I looked down at the short gentleman close to me, he was smiling. His beautiful sky blue eyes were full of light as he searched for acceptance. He said, "Good day," as he counted the few coins that he was clutching. The second man fumbled with his hands as he stood behind his friend, and I realized the second man was mentally challenged, and the blue-eyed gentleman was his salvation. As I stood with them, the young lady at the counter asked him what he wanted, and he said, "Coffee is all, miss," because that was all they could afford. I mean, they wanted to sit in the restaurant to warm up, and they had to buy something because they wanted to be warm. And then I felt it, our connection. The compulsion was so great, I almost reached out and embraced the little man with the blue eyes. After they took their coffee to a table, I asked the young lady behind the counter to give me 2 more breakfast meals on a separate tray. I then walked around the corner to the table that the men had chosen as a resting spot and put the tray on the table. The blue-eyed gentleman looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you." I leaned over to touch his cold hand, and I said, "I did this because God is here working through me to give you hope." I started to cry as I walked away to join my husband and son. And when I sat down, my husband smiled, and he said to me, "Well, that's why God gave you to me, honey, to give me hope." We held hands for a moment, and at that time, we knew that only because of the grace that we had been given were we able to give. We're not churchgoers, but we are believers, and that day showed me the pure light of God's sweet love. I returned to college on the last evening of class with this story in hand, and I turned in my project. The instructor read it and looked up at me and said, "Can I share this?" I nodded as she got the attention of the class, and she began to read, and that is when I knew that we, as human beings and as part of God, share this need to heal and to be healed. I graduated with one of the biggest lessons I would ever learn: unconditional acceptance. I end that story. Chop wood, carry water is to interact with the world and one another from our authentic self. Living from an enlightened heart intention is part of all religious traditions. In Buddhism, it is The student practices mindfulness and seeks non-attachment. The Taoist approaches the flow of all things, hopefully without resistance. And expressed in the Christian tradition, the prayer of St. Francis is an example of showing up from our higher self. I found a version of the prayer of St. Francis in chapter 11 of the book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, published by Alcoholics Anonymous World Services. And I want you to listen to the words as if it were your soul's instructions on how to chop wood and carry water. Lord, make me a channel of thy peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness. Where there is discord, I may bring harmony. Where there is error, I may bring truth. Where there is doubt, I may bring faith. Where there is despair, I may bring hope. Where there are shadows, I may bring light. And where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds. It is by forgiving that one is forgiven. It is by dying to self that one awakens to eternal life in spirit. Chop wood, carry water. It's all about showing up and the intention that we hold. May we bring love, and may we create only oneness. Namaste.